Welcome to Lessons from Life, the podcast that gleams profound life lessons from everyday life stories.
Hosted by Dustin, Fenton, and Brandon Hill.
A couple of years ago, I heard a speaker tell some college students that in every class they go into, they should ask the professor, why should I take this class and why should I take it from you? And so our first episode is to tell you why you should subscribe to this podcast and why you should listen to us. Often, when someone is trying to teach a lesson, whether it is a parent teaching a child, a teacher in the classroom, making a sales pitch, preaching a sermon, or delivering a public speech, we look for a story to illustrate the point we are trying to make. Why not turn this on its head? Instead, what if we explore our own life experiences and see what lessons we can learn from them as we are living them?
And that's what the point of this podcast is all about. We're going to share stories from everyday people like yourself and see what lessons we can glean from them to help us all figure out how to lead more fulfilling lives.
We have known each other for a long time. If I remember correctly, Dustin, you were a camper in my cabin when I was a camp counselor during the summer of 1992. So it has been almost 30 years that we've been friends.
Brandon is is probably the person I've known the longest outside of my parents. And so he's played a very influential part of my life and has been a great mentor to me.
Well, Dustin, I would say the same about you. You certainly have spoken greatly into my life as well. Interestingly enough, when I'm sharing with other people I meet about you, I always share that you're the best person I know at making an object lesson out of any experience. And you will hear about one of these a little later in this episode. Dustin has worked for a summer camp for many years and has also served as a resident director at a college for a couple of years as well and has a lot of great stories out of that. Dustin is married and has 2 young children.
And Brandon, he grew up in South Africa, spending most of his teenage years in South Africa before he came to Illinois to go to college there, and later served as a resident director for many years at that school, and then worked in higher education and has just known a lot of people through that time. Also, an interesting fact about Brandon is that he's a single adoptive parent and has raised his son really, really well and is off now thriving in the world. And Brandon just loves to travel. In fact, he's headed out somewhere next week.
In this inaugural episode for our podcast, we want to share with you our vision. We believe that everyone has a story worth sharing and worth hearing, and that those stories can teach us lessons for better living. Sometimes these stories have sad endings, and sometimes they are happy. Some stories may make us laugh, and others will make us cry. Some may be depressing, and some may be inspiring.
And we all have experiences that we look back on, that we learn from them at that time. But I'm guessing that we have more stories than that we can actually draw out either more lessons from those stories or new lessons because we're in a different stage of life. So the secret of the podcast is not that we're going to ask people to tell stories that have a lesson that they already learned. Just tell us a story, and then we'll pull out the lessons together. In fact, I think the reason we inherently remember stories is because they have taught us lessons, whether unconsciously or consciously. So re-engaging our stories may help us bring out those new lessons to where we're at today.
Part of our vision for this blog is to learn lessons for developing all parts of ourselves, whether that is physical, mental, social, intellectual, or even spiritual. We want to take a holistic approach, which means that even though we are not a religious or spiritual podcast, from time to time you are going to hear stories that may have spiritual life lessons, and these may be from frameworks of different faiths that our storytellers hold on to. It is important to remember that many religious leaders from different faiths told stories and parables to help teach important concepts. I guess the question is, can we learn a lesson from someone who has a different faith or religion background or journey than we do and still apply that lesson to our own spiritual journey?
We're planning on hearing stories from people from all walks of life, and some will be hard to relate to because they'll be so different from our own experiences. But this is where the beauty of story listening really comes in. You can learn and grow from the experience of another, and this is probably actually more likely to happen when the story is so deeply different from our own.
All right, well, let's hear our first story, and this is a story that both Dustin and I were a part of. A couple of years ago, was leading a group of students from my university on a spring break trip to visit some other colleges to explore how they do student affairs kinds of work. And so we were at the school that Dustin was at, and it was kind of late night. We were in one of the resident director's apartments playing games, and Dustin stopped by to say hello. Dustin said, "Hey, I've got a game that you want to play."
It's called the blanket game, or at least that's what I call it. We put somebody under the blanket. We put this blanket on this male student. The name of the game is just take off something you don't need. And after a moment, the male student tried to figure out what it was that he didn't need. And the whole time we kind of tug on the blanket as we say it, right? So maybe even imagine yourself right now with a blanket over your head, sitting on a chair, and somebody is telling you to take off something you don't need. And maybe some of you have already gotten it. If so, don't spoil the surprise if you're listening to somebody else. The person under the blanket, after a moment, took off a shoe. And at that point, everyone kind of gets it and is in on the game, but the person under the blanket just has no clue what's happening. And that's kind of where it started.
And it was actually pretty funny because you kept saying this over and over: take off something you don't need, take off something you don't need. I think the student took off one shoe and then the other, and then a sock and then another sock. And then his shirt came off and came out from under the blanket. And then his pants pretty much was at a point where I think he was just sitting under that blanket wearing his shorts.
But every time we would just kind of tug on the blanket with this cadence, take off something you don't need. Just, it wasn't clicking with that person what they didn't need. They were really engrossed with the game. They were going to win. They didn't know what the point of it was, but they were going to win, and that was important for them to win. And they thought it was some sort of a dare challenge. And for those of you that haven't picked up on the surprise ending of this, is that when you place the blanket over the person's head, what they don't really need is the blanket. That's the object there, is to understand that you don't always need the thing that you'd think you need just to play the game in life even.
Yeah. I think the greatest part of that story for me is, we're all the students are having fun. We're laughing at how crazy this is. And all of a sudden you just take the moment and you say, now what can we learn from this? And the whole demeanor in the room just really changed from one of having a lot of fun to this kind of serious growth moment. And it's always amazing to me how you can take those funny moments and change the tone in the room to one of learning.
Yeah, I think it's really important to always try to siphon out the learning. It's always fun in games until you learn something, and then it's a teachable moment. We should always have fun in games, but then also add in a teachable moment.
So what were the lessons from this game? Sometimes we don't see the big problem that we need to tackle. We waste time and energy trying to solve different little problems that don't help.
That's right. Thinking before acting. So even though this student kind of paused a moment and before he threw out the shoe, if he had thought a little bit more about the rules of the game, he could have just taken off the blanket ahead of time.
Yeah. And, another thing I thought about was, if something doesn't feel right, maybe you should just pause and stop before you make a decision. Because sometimes I think we move too fast, especially when we are having gut reactions that things aren't working. So Dustin, how many times have you played this game with people?
Hundreds of times.
And does anyone ever figure it out right away, or?
No. Usually it requires at least a sock and a shoe.
Okay.
And then people kind of start figuring out. Some people are, sorted out before others, but we do it all in good fun. We're not trying to make fun of anyone or, make sure anyone gets hurt or anything along those lines. It's always an opportunity to learn something.
Yeah, certainly. And to some extent, the longer the game goes on, the more risks there is for the person who's playing it, because there's less to get rid of.
And for the person facilitating it as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Because you don't want that to happen.
So Dustin, you've worked at camps for many years, and there's these things called hard skills, how to do it, how to climb the wall, how to ride a horse, how to jet ski or something like that. But there's also the soft skill piece that comes with that. Can you tell us what soft skills are?
In some ways, soft skills are really kind of the emotional intelligent pieces, which really makes a good leader. And so it's reading the room, it's listening really, really well. And that's what this podcast is about. It's about reading the room and listening well, and then being able to draw out and just raise a flag and say, hey, there's something about this. What do we think about what's happening in this situation? And allowing the group to respond to that. Mastering those soft skills are really important in any walk of life, because then you can begin to even interpret some things that are happening in your own life, but you can also help others interpret what's going on in their
Right.
life.
And that often takes times of silence, times of reflection, so that people can pause to learn those lessons. In student affairs, in the work that I'm doing, we often are trying to teach college students lessons, but really what seems to work the best is when they're learning lessons from the things that are happening around them. They're making choices and they're not working out so well. They stay up too late, too many nights in a row, and then don't get good grades on a test, or maybe they go out and drink too much and figure out what it's like to be drunk or have a hangover the next night. And sometimes those lessons from their own life work a lot better than reading a PowerPoint of instructions of not getting drunk or getting enough sleep. And I think that's what we're trying to do here as well. Is sometimes we have to learn the lessons the hard way, but other times, if we listen to other people's stories, we can maybe learn some of the lessons without having to go through maybe some of the pain that they went through.
So that's absolutely right. That's where that transformation piece comes in, and transformation is just such a powerful entity in our lives. And when we can capture that transformation and repeat it down the line, then we've got something. But it's really about trying to figure out how to pause and reflect before that transformation process can even take place. And I bet you've seen that lots of times when these students have gotten maybe a little bit too far beyond their yarn, and they have to pause and go, whoa, where am I at, and what's my next step, and how do I go from here?
Yeah. Well, between Dustin and I, we feel like we have about 200 people that we'd love to have on the podcast already and hear their story. And so we're looking forward to hearing some of those stories from people, frankly, all over the country and all over the world. And of course, for some of our listeners, we'd love to hear your stories as well. After the podcast, we really encourage you to check out our website and drop us a note so that we can hear your story. Dustin, good to spend some time with you, and looking forward to seeing you next week.
Yep, Brandon, good to hear from you as well.
Thanks for listening to Lessons from Life. We hope that you have learned a lesson today that will help you to be more fulfilled in life's journey. If you were inspired by today's episode, please subscribe and review. You can find Lessons from Life at lessonsfromlifeforyou.com. That is with the number 4 and the letter U. You can also find links to all of our social media on our website. We would love to hear the valuable lessons that you have learned from your life experiences.